Hi Canucks and friends, welcome to the Chronicle of New Eden. I'm Dan Znard, the co-CEO of Sorry in Advance, an alliance and wormhole. I'm also the co-host of the Canuck Capsule Chronicle. It's a weekly show about Eve's news every Tuesday at 19:30 Eastern Time Zone. This week is gonna be the first episode about the Jove, the mysterious empire full of legends. I feel the Jove are always around. It still have Jove Observatory in every constellation, and last year we discovered hidden gates from them, and even a hidden structure. If they have been able to hide those gates for so many years, I'm sure they're hiding a lot of other mysteries. I can't wait to learn more about them. So, are you ready to dive into this episode with me? Let's start it! The Jove Empires has always been a mystery to the other nations of New Eden, particularly as every new insight into its incrustable people tends to do little but raise more questions. First encounters with the Jove are inevitably conditioned by the unsettling appearance of members of their race. The Jove has practiced genetic manipulation of their population for millennia, and while still human, can seem quite alien to others. Due to their distinctive skin texture, disturbingly symmetrical facial features, and lustrous black eyes. Those who spend much time with Jovian individuals speak of them as almost inhuman in their lack of emotion, yet clearly driven by powerful impulse kept under careful control. Enigmatic as they are, the Jove are impossible to dismiss. One reason is their technological superiority. Jovian technology has arguably had a bigger hand in shaping the New Eden of today than any other force in the last century. Perhaps the most far-reaching example of this was the Jovian introduction of capsule technology to the Caldari, which paved the way for the capsuleer of today. Despite the best efforts of innumerable researchers, very little is clearly known about the history of the Jovian Empire. Even in the early days when contacts were being forged with the other empires, and the Jove took an active role in shaping interstellar society in the Concord Assembly, very few of their number were actually encountered in the core empires of New Eden. The territory claimed by the Jove Empire itself is spread across two regions on the edges of the New Eden cluster. The low numbers of Jove traveling into the core regions were initially attributed to the distance involved, as well as an aloof attitude in general. Over time, however, it came to be realized that the Jove had a relatively small population compared to the other interstellar powers, and it was learned that a deadly genetic malady, the Jovian disease, afflicted their race. Even so, it was still obvious that Jovian technology outmatched everything available to the core empires by orders of magnitude. This starkest reminder of the Jove Empire's technological lead over the other empires was provided at the Battle of Bac Actia, where an entire Amarian invasion force was laid to waste by a Jovian mothership. In recent times, the Jove has withdrawn, ever more reluctant to intervene in the affairs of other empires. It has been several years since the Jovian delegation to Concord has appeared, and their section of the Concord Assembly Station has been left vacant for even longer than that. Jovian commercial interests in New Eden remain in the form of their corporations, such as Denolution and Impro. But these are staffed by employees drawn from the other races. Some whisper that the Jove are gone for good, even dead, finally wiped out by the Jovian disease or some other catastrophe. Others point out that activity can still be detected in the Jove Empire, and that someone or something continues to defend their territory from unwelcome visitors. History origins. The Jove Empire's history stretches back to the beginning of colonization in New Eden. In a strange irony, the Jove's ancestors were some of the last to make the journey to New Eden, arriving in spaceship of relatively basic design. This ship had warp drives that could attain velocities only marginally greater than light speed, relying on cryostasis for the survival of the colonies they carried. The Jove established their society in the Utopia system of the Haven constellation. There are indications that the ancestor of these early settlers possessed a diverse collection of philosophical, scientific, and social tendencies, being unified only by mutual idealism. The early Jovian colonies seem to have been loosely affiliated, contacting each other mostly for mutual support in a situation where they were cut off from any contact with the other side of the Eve wormhole. The early Jove. Having anticipated difficulties in colonizing the system they had acquired and wishing to be as self-sufficient as possible, the early Jovian colonists were particularly well equipped for survival in isolation. Even so, with resources limited, many opt to remain in cryostasis to avoid putting excessive strain on the new settlement. This use of cryogenetics to relieve pressure on society seemed a natural extension of its use in the Jovian migration from the Old World. And indeed, cryogenetics will become a distinctive technology used by society throughout Jovian history. The colonies of the early Joves gradually began to diverge from one another as their separate philosophical and scientific outlooks developed. Several of these enclaves were devoted to the accelerated development of the human species, variously concerned by genetic modification, cybernetics, and psychological conditioning to explore transhumanist socio-political theories. It can be speculated that some of the direction taken by these groups were radical in the extremes. Inevitably, over the centuries, the increasing divergence between the enclaves led to conflict, with open warfare raging across the systems of the Haven constellation. The scope of the early Joves' internecine warfare is difficult to evaluate. A notable trait among these modern Joves is an implacable ruthlessness. If the early Joves shared this tendency, then it can be assumed that there were significant losses over the centuries of conflict. Yet, there also appears to have been a outward movement generated by the conflict and a large expansion of early Jovian presence beyond the confines of the Heaven constellation. While the ruins of early Jovian civilization are more frequently found around the systems of Heaven, there are sufficient sites across Curse and neighboring regions to suggest a relatively wide Jovian presence in the surrounding area. It is also quite likely that many chose to avoid conflict by retreating to the cryostasis tubes or taking refuge in virtual reality environments. Both technologies had by that point been brought to a high height by certain Jovian enclaves, with at least one prominent faction having combined the two to create an enclave within an enclave. The First Empire. Whatever the details of the early Jovian conflict may have been, it appears that around 10 to 12,000 years before the formations of Concords, the Jove resolved their struggles and came together to form the First Jove Empire. This achievement brought all the scientific and technological prowess of the various Jovian enclaves together under one nation, heralding a golden age for the Jove. Very little survives of the First Empire's history, but what fragments there are indicate that for most of its 8,000 years reign, it was a remarkably cohesive, productive, and peaceable society. Over the course of time, the highly diversified enclaves of the early Jove apparently grew much closer, and a people more like the modern Jove came into being. During the period of the First Empire, the factionalism of the Jove appears to have been limited by the overreaching authority of the people's ruling council. The convergence of many enclaves also contributes to the stability of the empire. And while the several distinct sociogenetic factions developed, their energies were diverted into playing particular important roles in the life of the First Empire. The wisdom of the First Empire's political structure lay in providing an environment for scientific freedom, while answering that the products of enclave research led to greater social and political cohesion. The ruling faction of the First Empire were particularly concerned about future developing technologies that promote the long view. As a result, cryogenetic suspensions, virtual reality environments, cloning technology, and longevity enhancement were constantly under research and development. The glory of the First Empire were tragically dashed by a catastrophic collapse. Though the factionalizing tendencies of the Jovian had been useful directly by the First Empire's coronament for thousands of years, in the end, the pressure could not be contained. The problems began when a particularly conservative faction achieved overall control of the First Empire. This faction, called the Elders, due to their extensive use of longevity technology to extend their lifespans, seem to have come to the conclusion that Jovian society had reached an ideal equilibrium, and therefore all efforts at change should be suppressed. The effect of their actions over the next few centuries was akin to trapping gas in a pressure vessel while neglecting to turn off the heat or provide a release valve. The founders of the First Empire had understood all too clearly that turning off the heat of Jovian curiosity and radicalism was not a viable option. They had therefore provided a release valve in the structuring of the polity so that every tendency in Jovian society could be made useful. The elder faction, in their desire to maintain equilibrium, attempt to enforce stasis on an inherently dynamic system. The eventual result was explosive. Amidst great destruction and chaos, the First Empire collapsed. The Second Empire, as is evidenced by archaeology in the Cursed region and neighboring regions, the collapse of the First Empire led to a considerable contraction of Jove-occupied territories. Those traces and ruins that survive outside the Cursed region and in much of its outer systems are very ancient indeed. The in-war collapse of the Jove appears to have been arrested by the firm and decisive actions of a man who has entered into Jovian legend, Mycobor, the first tyrant of the Second Empire. A dynamic and forceful individual, Mycobor is believed to have seized power in Utopia some 3,000 years ago, displacing the remnants of the elder faction apparatus that had clung to the seat of power. His ruthlessness and talent for strategy is the stuff of myth among the Jove of today. In a few short decades, Bo is held to have eliminated his opposition using any and every means at his disposal. With the entirety of the Heaven constellation under his control, he proclaimed the Second Jove Empire, inviting all remaining factions and colonies outside his authority to join the new state. Most Jove, tired of the chaos of the past decades, willingly reunite with the core of their civilization. Those that resisted were dealt with by Bor's fanatically loyal navy. While certainly ruthless in pursuing his goal of uniting the Jove, Mycobor was no mere warlord. Once the Second Empire was stabilized, he put in place a federal system where each Jovian enclave could promote representatives to an assembly called the ruling chamber. Recognizing that the power of the tyrant required legitimacy, Board provided for the ruling chamber to appoint one of its members to the office of tyrant. The system served the Second Empire well for a time, and the rule of the tyrant lasted for some 2,000 years before disaster struck the Jove once more. The Shrouded Days. The Second Empire never reached the mythical heights of the First Empire. The Jove's long-lamented Golden Age, but the fall that preceded was not so great as that which followed it. The Second Empire is looked back on by today's Jove as the last time of true Jovian greatness. In many ways, it was a definitive empire of the modern Jove, having been founded and populated by people not so very different from the Jove of the modern day. The fall of the Second Empire is a greatest horror for the Jove than the legendary collapse of the First Empire, because in Jovian terms, it took place a matter of generations ago, and it brought with it the nemesis of the Jovian race. the Jovian disease. Why the Second Empire collapsed is a mystery as complete to the modern Jove as it is to anyone else. Given the apparent connection with the Jovian disease, much speculation has focused on the malady. On this account, the survivors were those who were able to resist to some extent, but remain vulnerable over the long term. Many alternatives have been proposed, including yet another Jovian civil war, invasion by some unknown external enemy, or simple exhaustion of local resources and subsequent economic collapse. The evidence suggests that outlying settlements were destroyed. From the archaeological remains in the band of systems that constitute the other Second Empire, some kind of cataclysm is apparent. The ruins there are almost all in worse condition than the remains of the First Empire. In the Heaven constellation, some areas of the disaster was managed, but the following period of approximately 500 years is an historical black hole. This period is known by the Jove as the Shrouded Days. It is a topic of great pain for them, representing an immeasurable loss of knowledge of science, technology, culture, and history. Above all, it represents a calamitous breach in the genetic records of their race. The Jove of the colonial period, as well as the First and Second Empires, through all their troubles, had been connected by a carefully maintained genetic history. The Shrouded Days destroyed that history, leaving it account of the First and Second Empires fragmentary and introducing a gaping void of 500 years following what was arguably the hardest fall of the Jovian race. The Third Empire. Though it is not known how, the Jove survived the Shrouded Days, commencing eventually to rebuild their civilization as best they could. Scattered enclaves across the Heaven constellation renewed their contacts with one another. Whatever factional differences may have existed, no one was of any mind for future conflict. There were too few to dramatize and far too keenly aware that they had avoided extinction by a razor-thin margin. The remaining population was by now entirely reliant on artificial reproduction and irrevocably marked by the aeons of genetic manipulation various factions has indulged in. The opponents of this activity, most often referred to as the statics, and its supporters known as modifiers, each with their subfactions, eyes each other askance but had no choice but to work together. They soon realized that Shrouded Days had left them with a terrible legacy in the Jovian disease. The statics recognized the Jovian disease as a genetic malady, with some resemblance to a few conditions mentioned in surviving records. Even the most radical of the modifiers, while unwilling to concede that genetic tampering should stop, had to acknowledge that something had gone dreadfully wrong with the collective Jovian genome. Unity in the face of their adversity was the key for most Jove. and it appeared that a backhanded benefit of the Shrouded Days was that it had left the Jove more able to suppress their inherent factionalism and cooperate with one another. Shortly after re-establishing contact, the surviving Jovian enclaves form a coordinating body they call the Jovian Directorate. This organization surveyed the resources and records of the remaining enclaves and was able to piece together a picture of the science and technology still available to the Jove. While the obvious losses made for a grim account, the capabilities retained by the Jove were still of a high order. Most importantly, the ability to manipulate florins, a core Jovian technology for thousands of years, was still theirs to command. Still, there were several puzzles for the Jovian Directorate to confront, particularly concerning the various enclaves that had constituted the so-called Stasis People faction. Members of the static tendencies who had always made extensive use of the cryostasis and virtual environment. The majority of Stasis People enclaves were simply missing, with no physical trace left at all, and in all cases, the remaining enclaves were those in the moderate wing of the faction. The remaining Stasis People enclaves claim ignorance of the fate of their faction mates, but strongly argued that the time had come for the Jovian race to leave the Heaven constellation. The Stasis People were not alone in their argument for migration. The modifiers to an enclave argued that Heaven could not support yet another revival and could even be subject to unknown dangers that may have precipitated the fall of the Second Empire. Most of the other statics were reluctant, but the words of the Stasis People weighed heavily in the councils of the Directorate, especially as they counted among their numbers many Jovian scientists who retained a great portion of the race's surviving knowledge. To that end, the Directorate oversaw the constructions of 3 vast motherships, and using the expertise of the few remaining Stasis People, had chamber after chamber of cryostasis tubes built into their cavernous spaces. The Jovian motherships were designed to function with only periodic oversight from crews that rotated in and out of cryostasis. They were to move from system to system and carry out automated surveys in their search for a suitable place to establish a new Jove Empire. This combined voyage of exploration and migration took decades, but eventually, in one of the outermost regions of New Eden, the motherships settled on a suitable system and awakened the sleeping members of the Jovian Directorate. The Jove spent little time in hesitation, and soon the vast banks of cryotubes were opening out onto the dawn of the Third Jove Empire. Contact with the core empires. Once established in its new home system, deep in the heart of the G7HD TAC-F region, the Jovian Directorate decided on a new strategy of casting enclaves far and wide across the region. This strategy led the Third Empire to lay loose claim not only to the G7HD TAC-F regions, but also the neighboring A, 821 TAC A region. The Jovian Directorate tied this far-flung empire of small outposts and settlements together with a new corporatist philosophy in which enclaves were encouraged to move away from the previous model of organization along factional lines. Instead, enclaves adopt areas of expertise and function, linking themselves with other enclaves covering related fields in a quasi-corporate structure. It was a novel idea, but it allowed Jove belonging to different factions to work more closely together and considerably cut down on duplication of effort. Building on this expansionist theme, the Jovian Directorate began to send out deep space explorer units in an effort to gain a picture of the rest of the New Eden cluster. It was during this period that the Society of Conscious Thought was founded and, for a time, greatly influenced the political direction of the Third Empire. The old dividing lines between status and modifiers shift in curious ways, with the main debate now revolving around the exercise of the outward urge, contrasts with the need to maintain some kind of cohesion in Jovian society. It has been surmised that roughly 250 years after the foundation of the Third Empire, Jovian exploratory teams became aware of the rising core empires, in particular the Amor Empire and the Galante Federation. If this is true, then there followed perhaps 100 years of cautious reconnaissance by Jovian scouts before, in AD 23,149, the Jovian Directorate revealed itself to the government of the Galante Federation. Limited diplomatic exchange followed, but when the Galante-Galdari War broke out in AD 23,155, the Jove immediately severed all contact with the Federation. Almost 4 decades passed before the Jove decided to reveal themselves to all the races of the core empire in AD 23,192. A couple of years after mutual contact had finally been established between the Amor, Caldari, Galante, and Minlapar. With their unfathomable motives and astounding technology, the Jove were a complete mystery to the other race. Jovian cloaking technology in particular impressed them deeply. It was not, however, until the Amor-Jove War and the one-sided Battle of Vac Actia in AD 23,210 that Jovian weapons technology seared an even deeper impression into their minds. The Capsule and Concord. Contact with the other races appeared to reinvigorate the torpid factions of the Jovian people, and the Jovian Directorate channeled the roused political impulses of the race into a flurry of diplomatic activity. The Jove had made no trouble about accepting the Amor Empire's hasty-paced offer, and now took steps to establish diplomatic missions with the other races, including the fledgling Minmata Republic. The first notable product of increased contact between the Jove and the other races was their decision to supply hydrostatic capsule technology to the Ishukon megacorporation, effectively putting an hyper-advanced space technology in the hands of the Caldari state. Having given this technology to one empire, the Jovian Directorate now proposed a new interstellar organization for the purposes of mediating relations between the five major empires of the Amar, Caldari, Galante, Jove, and Minmatar. It has since become clear that one of the special mandates of Concord was to serve as a constraining check on the development of capsule technology within the sphere of influence of the core empires. While the Caldari state was permitted to cement its independence through its initial lead with the capsule, the proliferation of the technology by way of ethical licensing, its two other corporations in all four empires was overseen by Concord's Secure Commerce Commissions. The Jovian Directorate's special attention to the neutrality of the SCC may well have been primarily concerned with matters of spreading technological developments such as the capsule without a destabilizing advantage for any one empire. For roughly a century, from the foundation of Concord, through the holding of the Yule Conference aboard one of their own cruisers, to the establishment of Jovian corporations in core empire space, and nearly through to the modern day, the Jovian Directorate took an active, though measured, part in the political and diplomatic life of New Eden. The penultimate confirmed contact between the Jovian Directorate and the Concord Assembly was in YC 112 and concerned the Sanchaz Nation incursion into the Prosper Vault in the 3-TAC CE1R system. In a communique to the inner circle of Concord, the Directorate decisively announced the expulsion of the Sanchaz Nation fleet and the re-establishment of Jovian control over a facility that was stated to be an important materials repository in an outlying system. In YC 118, after half a dozen more years of silence, the Jovian Directorate transferred control of its corporations in the core regions of New Eden to the Society of Inner Thought, designate the SOCT as its successor in Concord, and finally withdrew from New Eden's astropolitical scene once and for all. The Jovian Directorate has remained completely silent since then. No manned Jovian vessels has been seen beyond the border of the Third Empire. The only traces of Jovian presence that remain are the corporation of the Society of Conscious Thought. Within either of those, no member of the Jovian race has been encountered for many years. Many believe the Jovian are gone. Some think that the Jovian disease has finally claimed them. Others suspect they have migrated yet again, perhaps into the depths of a warmer space, a region they call Ainoikis. The remaining four Concord empires do not speculate openly about the former fifth point of the star, but there is a good deal of concern nonetheless. Concord itself has cleared the Jovian section of its headquarters. Nobody in any position of authority is saying much on the subject of the Jove Empire. But whatever they may be thinking, there are few willing to openly act as if the Jove really are no more. I like the cryostasis was a way to avoid an era in the First Empire. Hey guys, I don't really like what's happening right now. I'm gonna go in cryostasis and please wake me up in, I don't know, 1,000 years? And at the Third Empire, the cryostasis became a way to work all together in the virtual world. It also means that even if, and it's a big if, even if the Jovian are physically extinct, it probably have few who survive in the virtual enclave. Do you think we're gonna wake a bunch of those people by exploring the fulcrum? What would be the consequences? Please tell me your speculation and comment. So this is it for this week, guys. Thanks for listening to me and see you next week, Kenix and friends.